Hello, and welcome to Rights for Free People from the Rhode Island ACLU. I'm Steve Ahlquist, hosting this month, and with me is Kurland. She's a community activist, advocate, and a Providence-based attorney. Hi, Hashana.
Hi, Steve. Good to be here. And I just want to give a shout out to PRISM Providence Youth Student Movement, where I work as the legal director of the Community Defense Project.
Cool. We're going to be talking about police procedures today, including body cameras, the juvenile searches, the Community Act, Comprehensive Community Police Act, and other topics on police filming of police and such like that. So are you ready to go?
Ready to go.
Awesome. Let's talk first about what I just mentioned, the Comprehensive Community Police Relationship Act, and the changes in the law concerning searches of pedestrians and juveniles. What do you think about that, or how's that working?
Yeah, well, I know there's a lot of folks, and I'm not one of them, that did some great work over the last few years and sort of had a lot of struggle getting this bill passed. I remember years ago there was a lot of community-based effort, and some of the things that came through when the bill was passed that are going to make a positive difference in the community have to do with, especially with consent searches and what is and isn't allowed anymore. Currently, as folks may know, police use so-called consent searches, and I always put that in scare quotes, as an incredible tool to just sort of search people when there is no legal basis for a search, whether in cars, whether pedestrians on the street corners. You know, I think unfortunately we've all seen people stopped and spread-eagled against a police car being patted down, cars being just torn through by police looking for something that very often they have absolutely no basis of knowing that something would be there. And often they'll refer to it as a consent search, and whether that's through intimidation or whether that's through a very broad definition of consent, that is often the way that they're engaging in those searches that often violate the Fourth Amendment protections that people are supposed to have. So one thing that that the new legislation, the new statute does is provide certain circumstances that police are no longer allowed to ask for consent to a search. So those include, and I just want to get the actual statute to make sure it's correct. They include the operator or owner passenger of a car, and also any pedestrian and juveniles. And it's not a blanket ban on consent searches, but what it means is that unless they have reasonable suspicion or probable cause that the person has committed or is about to commit a crime, then they are not allowed to ask for consent to search.
Right. So this would prevent, like, the police doing what they've done in the past, where they go to a group of juveniles and say, "Turn out your pockets." Exactly. And then they're just looking for whatever contraband, or just basically just to harass sometimes, not even, just to keep them on their toes, maybe more or less, or something like that.
Yeah, exactly. Fishing expeditions, often it's just to sort of get young people accustomed to having to be completely obedient to police commands and completely bend to their will.
Right.
It can be for intimidation. It can just be just in case they happen to find something, and just as a way to sort of set aside the Fourth Amendment. Right. But we know that when there's a police officer there with a gun and the power to arrest you or do other things, that the ability to actually freely give your consent, especially when you're a young person, is pretty limited.
Yeah, so now also this used to be known as the Racial Profiling Act, because it seems to be targeting people of color more than, let's say, white people. But when police actually search people, they find more contraband on white people than they ever do on people of color.
Exactly, and that goes to, I mean, all the statistical evidence that sort of points to, anything, whether we're talking about any issues of any criminal activity at all, that the targeting that the police are doing of people of color, particularly black folks, as well as Latinos, Southeast Asians in Providence, that targeting more people for searches, for stops, for arrests, ends up getting more people arrested, even though, as you said, the actual contraband that they're likely to find is going to be greater if they're searching white people.
That's really interesting. And so, all right, given that, then let's think about, would it be better than if, let's say, the police were wearing body cameras?
So that's a great question, Steve.
Yeah.
I want to back up a minute on the
Yeah.
question of body cameras in
Sure.
general. We want there to be a magic cure to police misconduct, police violence, police racism. It would be so nice to be able to just sort of put a technological device out there that's going to save us and make us safer and keep the police in check. But when I look at this, I mean, I came up in the years when, if folks remember, when Rodney King was viciously beaten by Los Angeles Police Department. Back then, somebody actually managed to catch the beating on video, which at that point was a pretty hard thing to do because you had those big cameras you carried around. So all of a sudden it's shown, it's captured on video, there's proof of what happened to this man. And yet, if you remember, the police officers that beat him were all found not guilty. And the people of Los Angeles, of South Central Los Angeles, just rose up in anger at that fact.
Right.
We also need to look no farther than Eric Gardner, who was murdered on Staten Island by police officers. That was caught on video, and yet the man who shot the video was arrested and charged and convicted, and not the actual killers of Eric Gardner. Right. So I think we have to first step back and recognize that whether abuse and violence by police is caught on video or not, there's still a question of whether or not that's going to make a difference, first of all. Second of all, there's significant problems with the way that these body cameras are designed. And I always kind of start with the issue that the fact that the leading manufacturer is none other than Taser International.
Right.
These are the same folks that manufacture tasers and have all kinds of cozy relationships with police chiefs and all kinds of financial interactions with departments across the country. In fact, the pilot program that's now been launched in Providence for the Providence Police Department is funded actually by Taser
Right.
and by the other company, ViView, the other major manufacturer. So it's kind of like, if the companies that want to sell these products and continue profiting off of police misconduct are the ones creating the situation to test out their product,
Right.
yeah, it's inclined to go a certain way.
Interesting. So under the test, they'll be wearing a body camera, and the police will have control over when to turn it on and turn it off, correct?
Exactly. There's no actual way, currently the way that these devices are designed, to turn control over to somebody else. So there's a button that the officer themselves, him or herself or theirself, pushes to start recording and to stop recording. Mm-hmm. Now, Providence Police Department, like New York and countless other cities that have had their pilots of these cameras, and the cities that actually have now implemented them citywide, have all these regulations about when they're supposed to test them or not. And in fact, the best regulations around are probably those that have been developed by the ACLU in terms of trying to put some more definitive requirements on when they have to be used and not used also, because there's this other question we can get into about respecting people's privacy. Right. But as long as the police officers have that control literally at their fingertip, then how do we know that those cameras are being turned off and turned on in a way that's fair and even, right? Aside from that, there's sort of issues with the field of vision. There was a great experiment that was in the New York Times online. I can't remember the name of it, but that actually shows some clips and asks people, you take a little survey to say what you think happened, you know, whether the officer was wrong or the person they were chasing or tasing was wrong. And it overwhelmingly, people pick what happened watching that clip based on their perspective on policing.
I'm sure. That's very interesting. So the field of vision is something like 45 degrees out here or something like that. It's wider. It can be as much as 70, but it's all from the perspective of the officer and sort of where they're turned as well, and sort of where, you know, it's not going to show the entire picture. It's not going to show what the officer is doing, right? And it's not going to show what's out of the camera's view, too. That's very interesting. So given that right now, Providence has a bunch of, like, I would call them experimental regulations they've instituted to see how they work with this test. So what is the issue with, like, regulations per se as opposed?
Well, I think that's a good question because, I mean, there's a few things. First of all, this is a set of policies that are a draft policy that they came up with just completely on their own. They had minimal community input. One very superficial meeting at 4:30 on a Friday afternoon where they had maybe 4 or 5 people from some community groups, including people that weren't actually even invited, like myself, to review the regulations, and then gave 1 week to give comment. These were not sent out to the public. They didn't gather any input or participation from the public before implementing. And then we don't even know if they took any of the comments or critiques that people made and implemented what they're using during this pilot period. And then, you know, the question is when they decide to make it permanent, will they make any changes at that point? There's problems just with the idea of police developing their own policies unilaterally in a vacuum without any public input, especially over something so controversial, as opposed to the idea of having legislation. So if there were requirements made through legislation and a state statute that governed the use, then for one thing, they'd be uniform across the state. And for another thing, there'd be at least some chance for some public dialogue, some public exchange about and critique of the proposals that the police are making about these.
Yeah, so like basically our legislators and our city councils could be talking about this. I know the president of the city council told me that they might take a look at these, but he didn't seem in any rush, and I don't think at the time he had seen the regulations that were in.
Yeah, I don't think the police department even bothered to share it with the city council, as far as I know. So it sounds like from what you're saying that they didn't. Now there is, in Providence specifically, there is an ordinance pending called the Community Safety Act that's been in the ordinance committee. Folks are waiting to see, I guess the public hearing needs to be happening, and then hopefully voted out of committee. But that would actually have at least a greater level of control over the use of the cameras, and it would have more of a it would be institutionalized, some of the regulations. It would have things like a chain of custody, because if somebody needs those for a legal proceeding, whether it's defending themselves criminally or trying to challenge through legal means the actions that the police officers took, you need to know that there's a chain of custody over those and that they're safe. Yeah,
one thing that kind of occurred to me is the idea that if the police had video, would I be able to access it through?
You know,
I mean, especially with a body camera, but any camera too, right? Why can't I see the video the police have of me?
Yeah, and you know, that's actually, I asked a similar question, in fact, at the meeting that the police officers had, and I was told that I asked if there are any plans then to finally adopt some regulations that would cover, or some kind of policy that would cover officers filming us just randomly all the time like they do. I mean, I know you're at protests, reporting all the time, doing your work as a journalist. You get filmed. I have been, when I pull out my camera, it happens too many times to even count, where I'm getting filmed by Providence police. And these are folks taking out their own cell phone, and sometimes in a really like aggressive manner, which, you know, if I wanted to be, I don't know, I could be scared by, a lot of people I think would be scared by sticking it right in your face, right? Or if it may be their own, an iPad or something, when there's protests, they're out filming. But even, you know, just literally on the street, when you know, question them about an action they're taking, boom, or you're taping them, they pull out their camera and start filming you. So whatever, okay, they've got my face, and that's like insulting or a little unsettling. I've seen them do that to people under the age of 18, to young people. You know, and that's stuff that even, you know, the United Nations and the Declaration of the Rights of the Child, I mean, there's issues around filming young people. What happens to that video?
That's what I wonder about that too. And under the body cam, they'll be accumulating thousands of hours of footage every week, right? All the officers, thousands of hours. And if I get pulled over, I might want to see the video just so I could share it on YouTube or something, right? I mean, not for any, you know, I got a ticket, okay, cool, but I'd like to share that experience in some way, because we all live online now. And it's an interesting idea, like what happens with that? Do I have access to it if I request it?
In the policies that are laid out that would then become law in the Community Safety Act would say that you would definitely have access to that video, and that they have to be able to give it to you within 10 days. So that's one piece. And then also it would put, if officers are using their own cameras and personal cell phones and anything something just extraneous to the actual official body cameras, those would be subject to the policies too. They can't just pull out their own private phone. I mean, we know of an incident, it was a very abusive house raid a few years ago, and there was an older woman in the bathroom, in the restroom, using the toilet, and the officers, when they busted in the door, he had his phone out, filming her on the toilet, and then showing it to the other officers and laughing.
That is a worrisome idea for a lot of people who value their privacy. And it occurs to me, too, that if you were in your home and somebody breaks in on a warrant, or even a justified warrant, let's say, you could be compromised, right? And you don't want that video getting out. Even if it's a video of a crime you committed, you don't necessarily want them to see other private aspects of your life. People making judgments on, let's say, the fact that you don't vacuum ever or something, right? There's all these things that we think about that's part of our privacy, and I think these are good things to think about, and I would like to see that done legislatively. If we're going to have body cameras, we should definitely have laws, not procedures, because I think procedures can be changed at the whim of a police chief or without public input. Right? And I think the public would have a lot to say on this if they opened up the public. What about filming the police? Now, turning it around, right? I'm outside and I see some car full of kids being pulled over, and I pull out my camera and I start filming.
And that's actually, this is one time we can say we can be proud of living in the region, the federal court region of the country. That's the First Circuit, because our circuit was the first one to really lay out, yes, we have a right under the First Amendment to film government officials, to film police. So that means as long as you're not doing anything else that breaks the law, right? So standing in a place where you don't have a right to stand, or kind of getting in the middle of the interactions between the police and the individual or the people that they're confronting, then you have an absolute right to videotape. Now, we know at least in Providence, and I'm guessing a lot of other places, that right isn't always honored by the police. And they have violated folks' First Amendment rights. We have a great community hero, many people know, John Prince, who's actually challenged them through the police complaint, through a civil suit, because when he filmed from his own front yard, behind a fence, officers on the street that were, doing doing official duties, rightly or wrongly, and he filmed them. They demanded ID. They wanted to know why he was filming, what was going to happen, and when he decided to kind of play it safe and go back inside his house, the sergeant at the time, who's since been promoted to lieutenant, ordered his two jump out boys, detectives, to chase Mr. Prince, to get that phone, and they jumped the fence and chased him into his house and tackled him into his phone.
So they entered his house and took him into a hallway. That's really disturbing, right?
Yes.
So given that, we have the idea that I'm filming police officers. Sometimes they set up situations where something happens and they'll just start moving that line back and back and back. And you don't get details, you don't see what's happening because you're so far back. There's a line set up so far away that your sort of free speech zone is, it keeps you from being able to see what's going on, even in a public street, right? If they block off both ends of a public street and push everybody to the next intersection, you can't see anything either. Even with a good camera, all you're going to get is a shaky blur.
And that's very arbitrary. I mean, I've gotten some good advice. I've gotten some advice that sounds good to me of when you're told to move back, take one step back. And you're complying if you take one step back. At the moment, it's probably not a good idea to challenge I mean, there's a limit in how much you can challenge where they set that barrier, but it's definitely something that we should be challenging, even if it's after the fact. Any restrictions that anybody runs into on their right to videotape the police, I think it'd be great to call the ACLU. That's something that's really ripe to push back against through the legal system.
Well, speaking of the ACLU, we have this. They've just put out this terrific flyer, Your Rights in the Police. And this is available at www.riaclu.org. And also, they hand them out when they do events, but this has got all the recent updates through the Comprehensive Community Police Relationship Act. And it'll tell you what to do if you're a juvenile, if you're a pedestrian, if you're pulled over by the police in a car. It'll tell you about consent searches and lay it all out for you. So this is a really handy thing that they've done. I want to just wrap up a little bit because we're getting to the end, but do you have any additional thoughts on the interacting with the police in general or safety tips?
Yeah, and actually I had some great discussion with some young people on it yesterday. All right, first I would just want to make one quick plug for, on the issue of body cameras, there's a great report put out by the Stop LAPD Spying Coalition that's somewhat specific to Los Angeles, but has great information and analysis that could help us here. But in terms of interactions with the police, I think the important thing is each individual has to weigh for themselves the risk level that they're facing and that they're comfortable with, and the wanting to assert their rights. There's no right or wrong for how an individual makes that decision. If you want more info about what your rights are and how to assert them, that's great. Things like saying, I do not consent, or am I being detained? But it's also for each individual to decide, because, somebody loves you and wants you home safe that night, and we know you don't want to go to jail either. Right. So for everybody, make that decision, but you should not have to choose between your safety and your dignity.
Sure. I totally get that. And that's cool. All right. Yeah. So thank you. And thank you for joining us for this month's Rights of Free People. For more information on police practices, you can always contact the RIACLU at riaclu.org. And if you think of any other topics you'd like the show to cover, please get them to us. There'll be information on the screen as how to contact us. And we'll see you next time. Thank you very much.
Great.
And thank you, Hashana.
Steve.
All right.